What I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to try to summarize, I hate to tell you, an entire book in this short period of time. But I think I can do it. And here's what I'm going to be talking about in order today. And I'll let you just read that instead of you can read faster than I can speak. And then I will show you that whenever you see orange, that's where I am. So if you doze off, you can come back and not totally lose track of where we are. So, about a year ago, this scientist in China named Zhang announced at the second International Gene Editing Summit that he had facilitated the creation of twin girls who were simultaneously the first germline modified children in human history and the first germline enhanced children in human history. The long-standing moral line in the debate about human genetic modification is the somatic germline barrier. Somatic means changing the body of a person in a way that the gene change does not influence their offspring. Somatic means changing them somehow, and so it impacts their offspring and their offspring's offspring, and in a very, very small way, the entire species. Germline modification is illegal throughout most of Western Europe and has been a long time ethical boundary in this debate. So, contrary to the dominant position in the debate about human genetic modification for 50 years or so, scientists at the second annual Gene Editing Summit ended up essentially endorsing the principle of conducting such research, just not until a number of conditions had been met. So in a statement at the end of the summit, the organizing committee wrote, germline gene editing could become acceptable in the future if the risks are addressed and if a number of additional criteria are met. These criteria include strict independent oversight, compelling medical need and absence of reasonable alternatives, plan for long-term follow-up, attention to societal effects. Another the things that Zhang did not actually do. Okay? But had he had done these things, it would presumably have then been acceptable. So, I want to ask, why was this particular moral distinction get rejected after 50 years of being in place? And here's where I'll give some various qualifications. So I'm actually a sociologist. I'm not an ethicist or a philosopher. I study the ethical determinants of bioethical debates and do not typically make ethical claims myself. The basic perspective is that the reason an ethical argument wins or loses in a debate is not just due to its internal beauty or coherence, but because certain social conditions choose it and make it more likely to occur. And there are macro social reasons why this germline distinction fell. I've written previously about these forces, such as change in professions in this debate, the rise of the administrative state as the arbiter of these discussions, etc. But I'm not going to talk about these today. Instead, I want to talk about sort of the microstructure of the debate itself, how people talk about this issue of human genetic modification. And this microstructure itself sort of facilitates or resists certain positions that you could take in this debate. So the real question is, the macro forces, the major social changes should have collapsed this barrier 30 or 40 years ago, but didn't. Why? Because the sort of microstructure of this debate allowed it to continue on. So I want to talk about this more microstructure. And the best way to understand this is through a sociological version of the slippery slope metaphor. So what is a slippery slope argument? Which starts with this metaphorical slope with the most meritorious action at the top, and at the bottom is the action that is maximally objectionable from the view of the top. If we step onto the slope at point A, and then it is more likely in the future that we'll select the currently undesirable option of B, and if you arrive at B, you're more likely to select the even less desirable option at C as you slide down the slope. Now, and eventually you're at the bottom of the slope where you didn't want to be when you took the first step. Probably the best known version of this in contemporary society is the debate about euthanasia, that if you allow medically facilitated suicide for people with terminal cancer, that it increases the odds you'll eventually get down further and further down the slope, and people are saying in the low countries right now, where people who have various mental illnesses can select for euthanasia, that the slope has slipped pretty far down. So what philosophers call logical or conceptual slippery slope arguments have a deservedly bad reputation. These basically say that once you've gone to A, it is inevitable that you've gone to B. You've essentially simultaneously selected B. Okay? But that's not how these actually work. What is more legitimate is an empirical slippery slope argument, and that is basically that when you've selected A, it increases the odds of getting to B and on to C. So in law professor Eugene Volok's terms, we need to think of the entire range of possible ways that A can change the conditions under which others will consider B. You have to identify what the social mechanisms are that increase the odds of you getting from A to B. So I'm going to talk about a very specific slippery slope in this debate, which let's call it an intellectual slippery slope. Now, these public bioethical debates, which is what this is a debate about what we as a society should do about some technical innovation. A lot of them are organized in this way. And so, for example, a lot of these debates are about what are the limits that we should put on scientific action. So if we do this, should we then really allow that? Should we really then allow that? So can we create chimeric mice? There are a lot of humanized mice out there. Okay. Well, we'll create a humanized mouse that has a human immune system. Okay. Should we allow a humanized mouse that has human qualities to its brain? Well, I don't know. How about a really smart mouse? So you have to draw your line on the slope here somewhere. So I want to discuss what was at the top and bottom of the slope in the original formulation of this debate about human genetic modification. The very first debates here involved eugenicists, and after they lost the debate, their position became the forbidden position at the bottom of the slope that everyone else was virtuous in relationship to. So what is a eugenicist? So these are people who believe that we should somehow improve the human species, typically genetically, okay, to create a better human. This was very common, for example, in the early 20th century, where people would have better breeding contests. You have state fairs where people would say that the genetically high-quality humans should breed with other high-quality humans to produce high-quality children. The people with lesser qualities should be somehow coerced into having fewer children. This reaches its maximal point with the Nazis, who deemed that certain entire ethnic groups were lesser and therefore should all be eliminated. We're familiar with this history. What people don't really typically know is that after the Nazis essentially killed off the idea of race-based or class-based eugenics, eugenicists continued on and thought to themselves, well, we need to encourage the reproduction of the genetically best people from whatever ethnic group. All ethnic groups have good people, okay, and we just need to find those folks. So that's what this debate evolved from. And I would say that the public bioethical debate about genetic modification, there's very high consensus at the very top of this slope is what's called somatic gene therapy, which again means changing this person here in the front row in such a way that if he had a genetic disease, it would solve his genetic disease, but wouldn't be passed on to his offspring. At the very bottom is germline modification for enhancements. So the fantasy of the reform eugenicists, as they became called, is to transform humanity to make us more intelligent by genetically modifying the species. There's two versions of, in this debate, what the bottom is represented by. People in the room may recognize the first book. This is what people used to worry about and what conservatives today worry about, which is the Brave New World, which is somehow by controlling what humanity is, we make us more object-like. We become dehumanized. In recent years, and current liberals are concerned about a different bottom, which is Gattaca. Gattaca is this movie, I recommend it to you, and basically what it is a society that is where reproduction all happens through facilitated processes, where maximizing the genetic qualities of your children is what's most important, creating genetically structured, embedded inequality into the species. So, to understand why the slope would slip towards Gattaca, the terrain on the slope is very important. The terrain is defined by what's morally relevant about the act on the slope. For example, whether the act of modifying a gene takes place in a test tube or a human body, that's actually not morally relevant in the debate and is not even noticed. But other aspects are. And in the human genetic engineering debate from the 1950s to the present, the terrain is a combination of genetic target and trait. By target, I either mean an existing person or the species. By trait, I mean any gene sequence that leads to a particular phenotypic trait. So, to take the obvious example, some people in this room are taller than others. Okay? That is in some complicated way, you know, some interaction of 200 genes that no one understands, but that's a trait that's genetically determined. So, the way this has been organized is the slippery slope starts with things that have been considered to be diseases, Tay-Sachs, this kind of thing, sickle cell anemia in the individual body, down to germline modification for the trait we call intelligence, whatever that is. Okay, so how does an ethical position slip down the slope? Well, these small steps down the slope are more likely in the absence of a sharp line between cases, when all the cases are aligned along a gradient or a continuum, and that all the arguments have a little small step between them. There are two features that I'll talk about that encourage the slipperiness. One is called continuity vagueness, where the terrain is a continuous measure. So example is driving. So why should a 16-year-old be allowed to drive but not a 15-year-old? Okay, there's an arbitrary distinction. There's no obvious line between those. That is subject to continuity vagueness. Okay? The second quality is similarity vagueness, where measurement is not possible or relevant, or when it depends on imprecise components. Let's think of the example of knife in English. What does that mean? Knife means all sorts of things that are sort of unrelated to each other. And I'll just leave you with the thought of what is disease? So when someone comes up with an answer, you've solved a philosophical problem for the past 50 years. But there's another problem that suffers from extreme similarity vagueness. So up until now, this continuity vagueness has not been important, because genetic traits and targets are the terrain, and they are not continuous measures. There aren't these traits that people notice are not continuously alignable. But similarity vagueness has been the major cause of slipperiness on the slope over the past 50 years. For example, what has driven the many small steps down the terrain of the slippery slope are the vague concepts of health and disease. For example, can someone tell me the experiential difference between predisposition to heart disease and predispositions to breast cancer? So you try to think of what's the difference between those two, and you can't even come up with one. Okay? That means that's subject to extreme similarity vagueness if you try to make a moral distinction between those two. And there's a reason why people don't try, because it can't be done. But we must ask in these debates, I'm talking about similarity, but similarity by what standard? Well, the similarity that produces the slipperiness is important, because you think about, for example, if you take the pen of Barack Obama and the pen of George Washington, if the standard is putting ink to paper, they're probably the same. But if the standard is age, they're fundamentally different. So the question is, what is the similarity we're talking about here? And in this debate, it is values. Okay? So 2 points on the slope can be made the same through one of those slippery slope processes if they're justified using the same moral value. So for example, using human genetic modification to stop someone from being born with sickle cell anemia and adult onset heart disease can be only made the same if they're justified by the value of what's called beneficence, or doing well, doing good for others. Okay? Those can be made the same. So my final piece of setup here is barriers on my slippery slope. Philosopher John Harris has written, slopes are only slippery if they catch us unaware and we've strayed onto them inadequately equipped. And the most important piece of equipment is limits. As Grenville Williams wrote many years ago, all moral questions involve the drawing of a line. And so these slippery slope theorists say that slopes can be sometimes resisted by standing on easily enforceable bright line rules. So, what makes a strong barrier? A strong barrier on the slope, and this talk is about one of the barriers, about the germline somatic barrier. Strong barrier divides two steps that cannot be made similar through similarity or continuity vagueness. So, my point is to explain how this germline barrier is near collapse and evaluate possible barriers that exist further downslope before we get to Gattaca. Now, I should add, for clarity right now, there are certain people who say, I want to get to the bottom of the slope as fast as I can. Okay? These are people who, for example, want to create humanity 2.0. This humanity 1.0, not very good. We age, we die, we get these things called diseases. Let's create humanity 2.0. So these people would typically say, I want to get to this, what I'm calling the bottom of the slope, as fast as possible. For those of you who don't want to get to the bottom of the slope, is there anything below on the slope that can be used as a barrier? So, we're halfway, hopefully. So, again, as I said, the history of this debate starts post-World War II with the eugenicists who wanted to find genetically desirable traits in all racial, ethnic groups and all classes. They had tried various eugenic schemes, like trying to convince women that they shouldn't have babies with their husbands, but should instead use the sperm from brilliant men. That didn't work out very well. You can imagine these various schemes. That didn't work. But when you get to the 1950s, all of a sudden, Crick and Watson discover the actual chemical description of DNA, and it gets these people thinking to themselves, well, why should we engage in all these schemes when we can genetically modify the species chemically? As Robert Sinsheimer, who was later president of the American Academy of Sciences, writes, the new technique allowed for a new eugenics. The old eugenics would have required a continual selection of breeding of the fit and the culling of the unfit. This new eugenics would permit in principle the conversion of all the unfit to the highest genetic level. We should have the potential to create new genes and new qualities yet undreamed in the human species. These are eugenicists. They want to perfect the human species, but now for the first time they can imagine, I could do this chemically through what we now would call human gene editing. So in the late 60s and early 70s, all this talk of creating the perfect human through genetic engineering creates social controversy, and mainstream genetic science was threatened by the bad publicity from the eugenicists who wanted to create the perfect species. To restrict controversy and in response to these critics, scientists advocated the creation of two barriers on the slope. Okay? They would put all the socially controversial things that they didn't want to do below the slope, below the barriers, and the things they wanted to do above the barriers. So the first is the disease enhancement barrier. Eugenicists wanted to change the human species to not only make us free of disease, but to make us more intelligent. So for example, Julian Huxley would say he wanted to use eugenics to increase, quote, man's desirable genetic capacities for intelligence and imagination, empathy and cooperation, and a sense of discipline and duty. So scientists wanted to put Huxley below the barrier. To save time, I'm not going to talk about that barrier anymore, the disease enhancement one, except to say it was once really strong, back when the difference between a genetic disease and enhancement was obvious. It used to be the only thing that were known to be genetic diseases were things that were immediately obvious in children, okay, that you could immediately knew that your relatives had them, like sickle cell, okay? Well, now with propensity to this and propensity to that, okay, the line has broken down, and it doesn't really work anymore. It's inherently vague. But the germline barrier, I want to talk the rest of the time on the other barrier they built. This was the most obvious barrier to build because the controversy was in changing the species, not in any changing one human. Eugenicists didn't want to change any one human. That wasn't the point. The point was to perfect the species. So what this results in is a debate that looks like this. So I'm in about 1972 here, At the top is somatic therapy for genetic diseases like sickle cell. The barrier is in the middle. At the bottom is germline enhancement, the goals of the eugenicists that everyone else was trying to distance themselves from. And I want everyone to think about this barrier a bit differently. It's not that this was the best moral position to take. It was the most defensible barrier above the positions that most people had. So when you, theologians of this era, for example, the germline distinction wasn't quite so important as avoiding things somewhat below it. But this was the only defensible position that existed on the slope. So we've got some fancy animation here. The debate is dependent upon particular values. Above this barrier, in the acceptable area, that was justified by the values of beneficence and non-beneficence. In English, that means doing good and avoiding bad. Okay? It was beneficent because the goal was trying to heal the disease in existing people. It advanced non-maleficence because any mistake you might make in one person would die with them and wouldn't be inherited by anyone else. The values below the barrier were the inverse of all the bad values the eugenicists were seen as having. The eugenicists were accused of supporting hubris, authoritarian views of imposing your vision of humanity on others, violating nature and or God's will. So the proponents of the germline barrier supported the inverse of all of these: humility, non-authoritarianism, following nature or God's will. So what is on the two sides of the barrier? Upslope, modifying an individual existing human. Downslope, modifying the species. Doing the act downslope would violate those values. So how can you make these two acts the same through similarity vagueness? That's what's required to bring down the barrier. Okay? I would argue that individual and species cannot be made similar if those are the values that are in the debate. An individual you could actually meet. The species is an abstraction. The individual is in the present. The species is in the future. Removing a disease from an individual is the role God assigned to humans in, fixing the fall, to use the Christian theological concept, whereas designing the species was reserved for God. I'm sort of channeling all the debates of this era here, giving you the sort of summary. And I go on and on with this, with the book that is hopefully forthcoming in this summer. We'll see. But the point is that this is implicitly the reason that this barrier was selected. It cannot be knocked over if these are the values in use in the debate. Everyone was assured that stepping onto the slope at the top was safe because it wouldn't slip beyond that point. But changes in values occur in the debate. Most importantly, in the 1970s, the debate was primarily scientists, theologians, and what I would call more like continental philosophers. And a new type of professional engaged in this era who's now called a bioethicist. What makes a bioethicist different from those other professions is that bioethicists use this minimalist system of ethics where they are promoting a few values that are portrayed to be the universal values of Western societies like the United States. So they use the values of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. If anyone wants further details about this, I can point you to some articles that say why that happened in that way. So the profession that was concerned about things like hubris, authoritarianism, violating God's will, these were the theologians. And as bioethicists increasingly control the debate from the 70s forward, the theologians left the debate, leaving fewer people who would use the values that were necessary to hold up the wall. So what happened was that bioethicists beginning in the mid-80s began to argue that this value of beneficence and non-maleficence cover the terrain on both sides of the barrier, and they just ignored what was below. So, for example, the head of the bioethics for the National Institutes of Health and gene therapy researcher French Anderson say that all we really need is the disease enhancement barrier, because searches for cure and prevention of genetic disorders by germline therapy arise from the principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, which create imperatives to relieve and prevent basic causes of human suffering. Society ought not to draw a moral line between intentional germline therapy and somatic cell therapy. A moral line should be drawn between both of these modes of gene therapy and efforts at enhancement by either mode of therapy. They want to ignore this germline somatic distinction and just rely upon the disease distinction. And why? Because they're not using the values that are necessary to hold up the germline wall. The people who are concerned about playing God, etc., were decreasingly influential in the debate. So, if beneficence and non-maleficence are all that matter, it looks more like this, where those values cover both sides of the barrier. And then, the people who are concerned about defending the wisdom of nature and the like, they're still involved in the debate, they're still vaguely there, but they're really far down slope. So these people are now talking about sort of extreme things far into the future. So if beneficence is your only value, then there is extreme similarity vagueness between somatically treating someone for sickle cell and altering someone's germline so they cannot transmit sickle cell. Okay, if that's your only value, those are essentially the same. So how is the difference between individual and species relevant if the only value is beneficence? There is no difference, okay? And so the barrier then should fall. But, like that, look at that fancy. But the barrier did not fall in 1990 because the motivation was lacking. It was not technologically possible, but one intellectual justification for doing it so had been put in place. People knew this argument. You will recognize that this is basically He Zhang's argument. He basically says, the person who recently helped produce these children, he basically says that beneficence and non-maleficence are the only values, and therefore he is justified in modifying the germline of these children so they supposedly be resistant to HIV infection. Other scientists disagree with him about whether the benefit he's really producing is actually a benefit, whether it's worth the risk, but they're just having a debate within this one value. Okay? And so therefore, if this becomes safe, and if he actually would have followed what are established research protocols, then it would presumably have been acceptable. So, the idea that people should be able to make autonomous choices about their bodies was a value that wasn't present in the original design of the barrier. Okay? Believe it or not, this was a time when doctors might not have even told you that you had cancer. Okay? And they didn't necessarily ask you if your permission to treat you. This is pre-Roe versus Wade in 1973, which legally enshrined the notion of reproductive autonomy. That concept didn't exist during the formation of the barrier. And so later on, this value appears in this debate. Okay? And in this era, people begin to claim that the terrain downslope of the germline is not about whether we should influence the species, but is simply another aspect of human reproduction, sort of making it a part of reproductive rights. Okay? So, prominent people in the debate begin to consider the entire slope to concern reproduction. For example, John Robertson claims that people have a fundamental autonomy right to germline because gene therapy of the embryo is closely tied to procreative choice. The U.S. Constitution gives the parent the right to provide his or her children with their descendants with a healthy genome. The right to procreate includes the right to practice negative eugenics. So, if value would cover, if your value is autonomy, that would cover the entire debate, and therefore the barrier would also fall. So let me try to speed up a little bit here. One of the new technologies of the 90s was pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which I will call PGD. The idea here is you use IVF, you produce fertilized eggs that divide to, let's say, 8 cells, you pluck one cell off, you can genetically test its qualities. The ones you don't want, you discard. The ones that you do want, you implant one of them in the woman, you produce a baby. Okay? Well, this was not originally discussed in this debate because it was essentially part of the abortion debate. But later on, in retrospect, this was essentially a form of germline modification. You are modifying the germline in a very small, imprecise way, but you are doing it nonetheless. And I'll just sort of summarize by basically saying it would be sort of an unintentional side effect, this germline modification of trying to have an individual produce a baby who doesn't have something like sickle cell. So, as of 1990, germline modification was then being practiced. It was this PGD, which is a very imprecise version, to later avoid a slide down the slope, what needed to have happened in 1990, but didn't happen, and the reason why the wall, the barrier recently collapsed, was someone needed to make a distinction between PGD and germline modification, between selecting an embryo that would change the species in a small way, and modifying an embryo. Okay? So that's what the difference became. We've been allowing selection germline for a long time with this PGD, but the new innovation is modification of an embryo. People don't really recognize this in the debate, and then here's the problem. What's the moral line? What are the values you're going to use to make a moral distinction between selection and modification? Now, I can come up with some for you, okay, but I don't control all of bioethical debate, and needless to say, this isn't going to be particularly influential. So, you know, one, just to throw, there's some philosophical, if there's any philosophers in the room, you'll recognize the difference between letting things happen and doing, but we'll skip that. But you could do something like following nature or God's will, which would be, avoiding modification. Okay, but these people who talk that way aren't really influential in the debate anymore. So, let me get to where we are now. A few years ago, scientists invented something called CRISPR-Cas9. I don't need to explain this technology. All you need to know is that for the first time, they might actually work, okay? And it's effective enough that for the first time, that these techniques could be safe. Quite quickly, people started talking about using it on humans. Not only to make somatic gene modification actually work for the first time, and it looks like it's imminently going to work for the first time in decades of trying, but oddly, maybe not so oddly, the very first thing people try to do is start modifying human embryos, okay? And so this sort of eugenic impulse rears its head, like, we can finally modify embryos. And so the news of earlier Chinese scientists experimenting on embryos in 2015 sends all these people back to defend the barrier, okay? To gather at the barrier to sort of defend the wall. Many statements by scientific associations and the like, and I'll skip to simply say that all of these references by these scientific associations are basically saying the reason you cannot move beyond the wall is safety, non-maleficence, because it's not safe. And it's true, it's not safe, okay? But they don't add any of the other variables that in the end would be necessary to defend the wall, because what happens when it is safe? Well, if it is safe, then that value covers both sides of the wall. You don't need the wall. The wall falls over. The barrier falls over, okay? So everyone was talking about safety, safety, safety. But people who are influential at the time recognized you cannot hold up the wall with non-maleficence. To their credit, they said, well, what happens when it is safe? Okay? The newly safe act just below the barrier would then slip to that location. So I like to think of it is if you only use safety as your value, the barrier just slides down the slope as your knowledge improves. As things become safer, this just kind of keeps going down. Okay? So what happens if Gattaca, if that all becomes safe? Well, if safety is your only value, then we should all be clipping each other's hair and genetically diagnosing itself to find the person husband. Did everyone see that movie? Yeah, okay, anyway, so that's totally safe if that's your only value. Okay? So this particular, there's a committee of the National Academy of Sciences that examined this, and for transparency, I need to say that I was a member of that committee. The committee advocates a barrier at what they called serious disease, okay, which is a version of the disease enhancement barrier, which I'll talk about in a second. But here's what happens here. The report focused very extensively on the fact that the acts of PGD in the center there, okay, and modification, which is slightly downslope, are so similar that they're the same. So, for example, it talks extensively about how there are these people out there who can't use PGD. There's these couples who usually, like let's say I'm a carrier for sickle cell, someone else is a carrier for sickle cell. There's a 1 in 4 chance that any embryos we would produce would have sickle cell. Okay? These people use PGD. They just get the ones that have sickle cell, discard those. Okay? But if I actually have sickle cell, okay, and my partner has sickle cell, all of our offspring are going, all the embryos are all going to have sickle cell. Okay? So what's the difference? What's the value difference that distinguishes between someone who can use PGD and can't use PGD? It would have to be something like there's a moral difference between people who are carriers versus have the disease. You're not going to create that. Moreover, there's another thing that the report identified, which is there are some people who don't want to kill all those embryos. Okay? So in PGD, you get embryos and you discard a number of them. Okay? There are people on moral grounds who don't want to destroy embryos. But in theory, with enough development, I'm not sure this is true, but in theory, you could genetically modify embryos without killing any of them. And therefore, if you are a strong believer in embryonic life, this germline modification would be morally better. Okay? So how do we draw a distinction between those two people? You'd have to create some sort of distinction like, well, the people who believe in embryonic life are somehow less morally virtuous than the people who do. You're not going to do it. Okay? And so therefore, if that's the case, you don't have that barrier anymore. So we got the couples who can use PGD for sickle cell because they produce disease-free embryos, the couples who cannot use PGD because they only produce, and then the people who value embryonic life. Those are the people on both sides now. Okay? So, without the ability to draw a distinction between those groups, that barrier finally falls. So, I get to the end fast enough so that hopefully we'll get a chance for you to ask me some questions before we run out of time. But what happened before is that there's almost perfect similarity vagueness between the points on either side of the barrier, and the committee advocated taking it down and replacing it with a barrier lower on the slope at serious disease. Now, you recognize before, the problem is, what is serious disease? Okay? This is inherently subject to extreme similarity vagueness, and to the committee's credit, what they had in mind, I think, was what is going to be scientifically possible in the next 5-10 years. Okay? And the only thing that anyone would ever try is something like Tay-Sachs, sickle cell, things like this. It's not necessarily going to be useful 20 years down the line. So the NAS advocates removing this somatic germline barrier, and those who want to keep it are supporting doing so with values that it will not end up supporting it. So what do we do now? And again, I just want to say that people who are like either libertarians, who would say you can produce any child you want anyway, it's up to you, or people who want to get to the bottom will say, we shouldn't think of this as a slope down, we should think of it as a climb towards virtue. Okay? And that these things are like handholds to reach the perfect genetic qualities of the species. But for those who have the sort of more Gattaca view, what would you build below on the slope? I want to dispense with some favorites of people in these debates. The first is many people want to draw a barrier at biological reality. Okay? The argument is it is always going to be impossible to do X. And so that can serve as our barrier. Okay? So you could say it's always going to be impossible to genetically modify polygenic traits. So let's say there's 100 genes that interact in some way to produce trait X. That will always be impossible to modify, and therefore that can be our barrier. And I don't have any evidence to give you except to say I think it's a loser move to bet against human ingenuity. Okay? And that that never works out. And I'll give you a quick example, which is in the earliest government debate about human germline modification in 1983, a very famous geneticist named Arno Matulski tried to say, we don't even need to do this discussion because I don't want to talk about anything that's not going to be possible for 50 to 100 years. Okay? In actuality, 49 years after that discussion, this became possible. So I think it's just not good to bet against human knowledge. So that guy dies. Okay. So like a barrier installed at safety, there's the biological reality thing just kind of slides down the hill as our knowledge goes. So it's not really a barrier, it's like a sliding wall. In the book, I examine the strength of barriers different individuals or organizations have proposed that would be placed below the germline barrier, those that are structurally sound and present and supportive values are in green, those that are not structurally sound are in red. This is like a advertising for the book. You eventually, I'll get like 90 cents for every book that I sell, so I'll be rich, undoubtedly. And so that one's gone, right? Let us assume that that one's gone. What's below? Well, the NAS suggested a barrier at severe disease, okay? But in the long run, as I said before, once it becomes possible that you start getting these things that are like propensities towards this and propensities towards that, is that severe? What is severe? This becomes incredibly susceptible to similarity vagueness. Similarly, some bioethicists propose what they call a professional domain account, where the existing medical profession defines what a disease is, and that will be the barrier. Okay? The problem is that what the current medical profession defines as a disease is a moving target. So much so that sociologists have a term for this called medicalization. Okay? As medicine sort of takes on more phenomena of human life, their definition of a disease just keeps going. Moreover, this is the profession that does engage in elective plastic surgery, which you could argue is an enhancement. So I think it's difficult to imagine this as a barrier that would possibly hold. Way down near the bottom of the slope is, let's call it bioethics liberalism, where you can engage in any modification you want, as long as it maximizes autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence. On the downslope would be any modification that harms someone. This is essentially Lockean liberalism built into a genetic barrier here. Okay? A couple problems with this, though. Number one, this is really near the bottom of the slope for most people. Okay? Once you can do anything you want, the debate is sort of almost completed. Okay? The other problem is it's actually it's susceptible to similarity vagueness, because what is risk in the first place? Okay? And what is harm? Is it harmful if your kid is sitting next to a classroom with some genetically modified kid in the class? So we'll see. And then there's actually a very strong barrier at the boundary of humanity, believe it or not, which is you could say you can genetically modify embryo in any way as long as you do not insert a gene that has never existed in the human species ever. So you could have no glowing green children, you could have no part elephant, but this would be a barrier that would hold. It has very strong properties. It's not subject to similarity vagueness. It is not subject to continuity vagueness. It's just essentially at the bottom of the slope. Okay? And then finally, the most prevalent variant barrier, which is something I've cooked up as something that will potentially hold. And to see what I mean by that, everyone can buy the book, and the next time I come to give a talk, I will take my probably a total of $4.50 profits from the people in this room, and I'll buy everyone part of a donut so that I'm not profiting from this thing. And so with that, I'll stop and take any questions you might have.